Good afternoon. I'm Gert from Haas. I'm a neuropsychologist and a professional musician. I studied classical and electric guitar at the Amsterdam Conservatorium. Graduated in 1992. I'm specialized in what you can call very specific learning situations, which means that I work a lot with dancers, musicians, athletes, but also with people with mental retardation, brain damage patients. And this is really one group. Why is it one group? Because they all have a brain, and the brain does what it does, and we can think about how the brain works. We can have our own thoughts how the brain works, and we can, from a psychiatric point of view, state that someone's autistic. We can, from a brain damage point of view, say that someone has frontal damage with all the consequences of it. We can, from a other point of view, state that someone's very creative, but not so very well equipped with normal planning and organization skills. And all these things come from the same brain. The brain has its functions, and we have to deal with that. I also teach a lot in rehabilitation, and as long as you don't want to do anything special, it doesn't matter what you do. If I walk to the Albert Heijn, it doesn't matter how I walk. If I get brain damage, then it starts to matter. If I want to have a career in dancing, or in music making, or in sports, if I want to be among the elite people, then it starts to matter. And this is what I'm specialized in. And one thing I'd like to speak about, actually the only thing I'd like to speak about, because I have about 20 minutes, is some research that I've been doing a few years ago about what strategy people use when performing. And of course you use lots of strategies. But one is particularly important. And this is the one that says, when you're in a closed skill, I'll explain later what it is. What strategy do you use? Do you use a visual or a kinesthetic strategy? Visual, we know, you look around. Kinesthetic comes from sensor systems in our joints, in our muscles, and is what we call feel for movement. No one at this point looks at his or her own foot, but it's still there and you can feel what position it is in. I hope. If not, warn me later and we'll talk. When you're learning a new skill, a closed skill, we speak about a skill that's not dependent on the environment. The penalty when playing football, the service when playing tennis, but also when you're making music. We buy these special instruments. We know what strings we want to use. You know, dancers have their special floors and know what floor they want. So we keep our environment in a very special way so that we can function and can trust the environment. Now, you would think that if a dancer and a musician start playing, that they don't look at their instrument, and they don't look where they're standing, because it's automatic. So, there is a kinesthetic sensitivity test. Kinesthetic sensitivity test. There's one in Amsterdam, at the Vrijdag, and there's one in Codarts. Are you okay?
Yes.
Sorry. And what you measure is the sensitivity from a person and the amount in which he or she uses visual or kinesthetic strategies. You want some water?
I think so.
Here's some.
Now, I always thought, and looking at the literature, it's also what they say, is that I'll use this test with musicians, because they don't have a clue what they're doing. I can tell because I'm one. And we'll, as a control group, we'll use the dancers because they're the ultimate kinesthetic people. Much to my surprise, this wasn't true. Dancers don't know what they're doing either. So this is where we got into trouble, but it also explains some things. And I'll use a dancing example. Working with the mirror is a very important part of learning to dance, but also when you jump and turn, then you pick a point at the wall and now you're back. This is a visual thing. Now you would expect, once you're working much more automatic, that you translate this and make it from a visual an internal thing. If you don't, you may get into trouble when you're in a different environment. Because here, if I'm standing here, I can use that line to focus on. But what if I'm standing here? Where do I focus? Of what if there's a curtain? What if the stage is higher? What if the stage is bigger? What if the colors differ? And our brain doesn't recognize this as the same thing. If I depend on the environment, if I use a visual strategy, if the environment changes, the skill changes. So, with a closed skill, you depend on kinesthetic strategies. This was my research. I did this test. And what we saw that, of course, musicians were terrible at this. So the musicians, once automated, a skill still used a lot of visual guidance, we call this. Then came ordinary people. And only a little bit above average came the dancers. This means that our thoughts about dancers using almost only when skilled kinesthetic feedback is not true. Once you know this, you can start analyzing what can go wrong on stage. You can start analyzing about spacing, what is spacing for one person and what is it for another person. But you can only do this once you know it. Now we know it. In a normal closed skill, you go from a visual strategy towards a kinesthetic strategy. Shouldn't you ever look? Of course you should. In the beginning, a visual strategy helps you faster and better. But over here, the kinesthetic strategy helps you faster and better. So it's not one thing or the other, it's how you use it, and at what moment you use it, and how you have an inborn or a learned feel for changing from one to the other. This is just one example of knowing that differences matter. You can see for yourself if the environment, at school we had this